the winter of 1863, when cannon fire rolled across the Tennessee hills, the Chamberlain estate stood untouched. Its white-pillared house rose above the cotton fields like a fortress of wealth, its windows glowing warm against the cold. Rows of cotton stretched to the horizon, the boles pale against the dark soil, each one a thread in the tapestry of a fortune built on the backs of the unseen. The war raged far enough away that the family could still host dinners, still polish silver, still speak in measured voices about market prices. But beneath that calm surface, something else had taken root. In the nearby town, whispers traveled from porch to porch. Men spoke low over whiskey about workers who had vanished from the fields without notice, their cabins left in perfect order, fires still smoldering in the hearths. Women told each other of nights when they saw lanterns moving deep in the rows, long after the day's picking was done. A sound would drift on the wind then, the faint, sharp rhythm of shovels biting into clay. On the far edge of the estate, a grove of ancient trees stood fenced and locked. The family called it private land, a place no one had reason to enter. But those who had wandered too close claimed the air grew heavy there, the ground soft beneath their boots, as if the earth itself were unsettled. Some swore they heard voices, a low, steady murmur that stopped the moment they turned to listen. The Chamberlains did not acknowledge these stories. They moved through town with the ease of those untouchable by rumor, yet their servants avoided the grove, never speaking of it even when pressed. The overseer kept a ring of iron keys at his belt, and one long and blackened with age, never left his possession. It was said that if you stood at the fence at night, you might see him there, his lantern casting long shadows over the roots, the metal of his spade glinting in the moonlight. The war might have threatened the South's great houses, but here something older and more patient than war was at work. Whatever secrets lay beneath those trees had been sown long before the first gun was fired. The Chamberlain's fortune was fed by the soil. But the soil, it seemed, had a memory, and when the wind bent the branches, you could almost believe it was trying to speak, if only you knew how to listen. Nathaniel Chamberlain Jr. was 19 the night he vanished. The youngest son of the dynasty, he carried himself with the restless energy of someone too young to understand fear. That evening, a pale fog had drifted in from the river, swallowing the horizon until the world seemed to end just beyond the stables. The moon was a dim blur behind it, the air damp and cold enough to cling to the skin. Nathaniel saddled his horse without a word to anyone, leading it out with the quiet confidence of someone who believed every acre of land was his by birthright. A stable hand, a boy no older than 13, claimed he heard Nathaniel tell the mare they were headed to the old cotton gin. No one asked why. The gin had been shut for years, its wooden walls leaning with age, the machinery inside choked with rust. Still, the path to it cut straight past the grove, and most kept away after dark. The boy said he watched until the fog swallowed rider and horse, the sound of hooves fading until there was nothing but silence. It was nearly midnight when the mare returned. She came at a slow, uneven walk, reins dragging in the dirt, her flank wet and streaked with thick red clay, the kind of clay found only in the low hollows near the grove. Her eyes rolled white at every sudden sound, sides heaving as if she'd been ridden hard, then stopped, then run again. There was no sign of Nathaniel, no coat, no hat, not even a boot in the stirrups. By lantern light, the overseer inspected the mare. His face did not change, but he sent the stable hands away and led the animal into her stall himself, shutting the door as though afraid she might bolt. He told no one to go searching that night. The next morning, with the fog burned away, a few men walked the path toward the gin. They found hoofprints for half a mile before they stopped abruptly in the churned earth, near the grove's fence. No tracks led away, no broken boards in the fence, just the thick smell of damp soil and something faintly metallic beneath it. Nathaniel Chamberlain was never seen again. His disappearance was spoken of in the quiet way one speaks of storms, dangerous, unpredictable, and best not invited back. And in the weeks that followed, More than one person swore they saw a lone rider in the fog, moving toward the grove, never coming out. They were found by accident, tucked inside a hollow space behind the wainscoting in the upstairs study. 23 envelopes, each addressed but never sealed, the ink browned with age. The handwriting was neat at first, precise, but as the pages went on, the lines began to lean, the loops tightened, as if the hand that wrote them trembled. They were all signed the same way, Sarah Chamberlain, and dated between the spring of 1863 and the winter that followed. The earliest letters spoke politely, almost stiffly, to a friend in Charleston. Sarah wrote of the war, of the shortages in town, of Nathaniel's disappearance, and her father's strange quiet since that night. She mentioned that the servants had grown restless, whispering about shadows moving in the cane rows. One wrote in the ledger that there were watchers in the fields after sunset, tall figures standing perfectly still among the plants, vanishing when approached. By midsummer, her words grew more urgent. She described lying awake at night and hearing the low sobbing of a woman, muffled as though coming from beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. Once, she pressed her ear to the boards and thought she heard fingernails scraping the wood from the other side. She told no one. The letters from autumn were different still, shorter sentences, long pauses between thoughts. She began writing about her father's walks, how he would leave the house each night after the lamps were put out, carrying a lantern and something long wrapped in burlap. Sarah followed once, from a distance. She wrote of watching him pass the stables and head toward the grove, the orange glow of his lantern bobbing between the trees. She stayed just long enough to hear the dull thud of metal on soil, over and over, until the sound slowed, then stopped. In the last few pages, Sarah's tone shifted entirely. She wrote of a pact, though she never explained its terms, spoken of in hushed arguments between her father and the overseer. The words "the price" and "the yield" appeared again and again, tied together in a way that made her afraid to ask questions. Her final letter was the only one not addressed to anyone. It was just a single sheet, half-filled, the handwriting almost unreadable. "It feeds us," she wrote. "It keeps us. But it takes from us what it chooses, when it chooses." Nathaniel was only the first. "I hear it in the roots now, calling my name. I think I will answer." None of the letters were ever sent. No one knows why she kept them hidden. But the hollow in the wall where they were found was lined with red clay, the same clay from the grove. The winter of 1863 settled over the Chamberlain plantation like a shroud. Frost clung to the bare branches, the cotton fields lay stripped and grey, and yet the air seemed heavier than the season could explain. By January, the overseer's records began to change. The neat tallies of harvested bales gave way to short, grim notations. Absent, no return, replacement needed. In the span of 3 months, 73 names vanished from the rolls of the enslaved. The parish kept no record of their passing. In the church's burial book, there is no mention of them, no dates, no sermons read over their bodies, no graves marked with wooden crosses. Officially, it was as though they had never existed. But people in town spoke of the smell that carried on the cold wind at night, and of the wagons seen moving toward the grove under lantern light, their wheels muffled by cloth to keep from waking the house. Decades later, those stories might have remained only that, stories if not for the scans. In the early 2000s, a team from the State Historical Society brought ground-penetrating radar to the property, seeking the original boundaries of the fields. What they found instead was a cluster of 73 anomalies beneath the grove's packed soil. Each was the size and shape of a grave, arranged in uneven rows that curved with the roots of the trees. Standing there, you can almost picture it. The frost-covered ground, the hollow sound of shovels cutting into frozen clay, the breath of men rising in white plumes. No prayers, no words spoken over the dead, just the steady work of filling the earth. Theories have followed the discovery like carrion birds. Some historians point to disease, a fever that swept through the quarters in the damp of winter. but disease leaves traces, records of the sick, of attempts to save them, and here there are none. Others whisper of killings, swift and hidden, meant to silence unrest. And then there are the darker stories, told only in a lowered voice, that the Chamberlains had long made offerings to whatever dwelled in the grove, and that year, the war had left them desperate enough to offer more than ever before. The soil there is different, richer, redder. Samples show higher levels of iron and phosphates than anywhere else on the property, as though something beneath had been feeding the land for generations. The trees that grow there stand taller than any others nearby, their roots twisting in ways that seem almost deliberate, as if they have learned to reach for what the ground keeps. 73 lives, gone in a single winter, and the grove still stands, keeping them close. It was found under a loose board in the attic of the overseer's quarters, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone brittle with time. The ledger was smaller than expected, its leather cover cracked and curling at the edges, the pages yellowed and fragile. At first glance, it seemed ordinary columns of dates and figures, notes on the yield from each field, records of supplies ordered from town. But as the pages turned, the rhythm of the entries began to change. Beneath the neat lists of cotton bales and seed shipments were other notations, written in a smaller hand, as if they were never meant to be read by just anyone. Delivery received appeared often, paired with no supplier's name. Quiet removal came next to dates that matched the coldest nights of winter, and in the margins, faint but deliberate, were symbols, circles intersected by lines, marks that looked like roots branching outward. Once, a crude drawing of a tree whose roots seemed to curve around the outline of a human figure. Midway through the year, the handwriting changed. The crisp, practiced script gave way to heavier strokes, uneven spacing, and the occasional smear where the ink had bled. Whatever had happened to the original keeper of the ledger was not recorded, but the shift was stark enough to feel like an absence on the page. The new hand continued the records, but with more detail in the secret entries. The number of quiet removals rose sharply in late 1863, matching almost exactly the estimated dates of the unmarked graves later found in the grove. And then came a line that drew a chill, even across the years. The ground responds, yield increased. The phrase appeared twice more before the end of the year, each time after a cluster of removals. The pattern was unmistakable. More taken from the quarters, more cotton from the fields, as though the soil itself had joined the work, giving back in proportion to what was buried in it. Some of the symbols in the margins matched those carved faintly into the inner fence of the grove. No one knows who made them, or if the overseer understood what they meant, but their presence tied the ledger to the heart of the Chamberlains' guarded land. The book ends abruptly in early spring. The last entry is just 2 words, written larger than any before it. No more, whether it was a warning, a refusal, or a record of something ending. The pages that might have explained it are gone. Only the ledger remains, smelling faintly of clay, as if it had been buried once, and dug up again. They called them the nights of the midnight harvest. Long after the day's work was done, when the last baskets of cotton had been weighed and stored, a quiet order would pass from the main house. Everyone was to leave the fields. No loitering near the rows, no lingering by the grove. The message was simple, but the weight in the voices that carried it left no doubt. Disobeying was not an option. Descendants of the sharecroppers who lived nearby still tell of watching from a distance. They would see the fields go dark just after sundown, only for small points of light to appear an hour later. Lanterns, dozens of them, weaving slowly between the rows like fireflies bound to the earth. Sometimes the lights moved in a line, as if following a path invisible to anyone else. Other times they clustered together, then fanned out again, like the shifting of a silent crowd. From the ridge road, you could hear the carts, the creak of wood and iron, the steady clop of hooves, muffled by layers of damp burlap. The wheels did not rattle like they carried cotton. The weight was heavier, shifting strangely with each bump, and beneath it all, there was the smell, thick, loamy, and sharp, with the metallic tang of wet clay, as if the earth itself had been turned over and left open to the night air. Some said they also heard voices. Not the voices of men talking, but something lower, more measured, a rhythm of sound, words without meaning, spoken together in a way that made the hair along the neck rise. One woman, recalling her grandmother's story, said it was like a prayer, but not one she had ever heard in church. Others described it more like a chant, each voice blending into the next until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. By dawn, the lanterns would be gone, the carts vanished back into the shadows, and the fields would stand as if nothing had disturbed them. But the soil at the far end, near the grove, would look freshly turned, darker than the rest, and the trees themselves seemed to lean a little heavier over that spot. Years later, when the grove was scanned, and the graves mapped, the patterns in the soil matched the places where the lights had once been seen. It was as if each midnight harvest was not a harvest at all, but a planting of something the Chamberlains valued more than cotton. The descendants speak of it with a strange mix of fear and certainty, as if some knowledge has passed down in the blood. They say the land was fed on those nights, and in return it fed the family, and that sometimes when the wind is still, you can see a flicker of lantern light moving through the rows, long after the last Chamberlain was laid to rest. They say the grove behind the old Chamberlain place has a way of keeping you longer than you mean to stay. Hunters have told of stepping between its trees in the clear light of afternoon, only to find the shadows thickening faster than they should, the air cooling until their breath came in short white puffs. Paths twist there in ways the mind can't seem to hold on to. A man might walk straight ahead and find himself back where he started, his boots marking the same patch of soil he swears he only just left. Some claim the feeling of being watched begins before you even reach the fence. Eyes on your back, the faint pressure of something pacing your steps, just out of sight. And then there are the whispers, soft enough that you can't quite tell if they're real, but steady enough to make you stop and listen. One hunter said it was like hearing a conversation through a wall, the words just out of reach. Another swore he heard his own name breathed right behind him, though he was alone. Travelers passing through at night told of losing the moon entirely once under the canopy, the branches weaving so thick overhead they blotted out even the stars. In that dark, the whispering grew clearer, short phrases, sometimes in a woman's voice, sometimes a man's. The unlucky ones said the voices seemed to circle them, moving from tree to tree. In recent years, a group of paranormal investigators brought recording equipment into the grove. Their cameras caught nothing unusual, but the audio told a different story. In the quiet stretches, beneath the sounds of boots on leaves and wind through branches, there were murmurs, faint, almost drowned by the static. But there, one clip captured a woman's voice saying, "I hear it in the roots now," a line found word for word in one of Sarah Chamberlain's hidden letters. Another recording picked up something like a man's voice repeating, "The ground responds," over and over until it faded into the noise. That phrase, too, was tied to the ledger found in the overseer's quarters, as if the grove had kept those words, holding them the way the soil held the dead. No matter how many stories are told, the place remains what it has always been, a tangle of trees and shadow, keeping its own counsel. Yet those who have stood there say the same thing: the grove feels alive, not just with the rustle of leaves or the creak of wood, but with something older, listening back. And if you linger too long, you might just hear it speak. The spring flood of 1871 came fast, the river swelling over its banks in a matter of hours. Water rushed through the low fields, filling the hollows, licking at the edges of the Chamberlain warehouse, where the year's cotton was stacked high in neat, white-wrapped bales. By morning, the ground floor stood in 2 feet of muddy water, the current swirling against the lower tiers. Men worked quickly to save what they could, hauling the bales to higher shelves, prying them from the soaked boards. It was when they began lifting the last row that the first bale split. The burlap tore under the strain, spilling cotton into the floodwater, but the cotton was not clean. It came away in heavy, clumped pieces, matted with something dark that stained the men's hands. The smell was immediate, thick, sour, and metallic, cutting through even the stink of the flood. One man gagged, another dropped what he was holding and stumbled back, muttering a prayer under his breath. As more bales were moved, more of the same appeared. The lower layers, pressed tight under the weight above, had trapped the smell until the water and rough handling broke them open. Beneath the topmost white fibers, the cotton turned rust red, stiff in places as if it had been soaked long ago and left to dry. The stains were deep, almost black toward the center, and no amount of rinsing in the floodwater made them fade. The Chamberlains called it river mud. They told the laborers the water had brought up silt from the bottom, staining the cotton as it seeped in, but the men who handled it knew better. Mud did not smell like that. Mud did not cling to your skin no matter how hard you scrubbed, leaving behind a faint coppery tang on your fingers and in the back of your throat. Some of the older hands remembered the winter of '63, the disappearances, the wagons bound for the Grove. They said nothing openly, no one spoke that way in front of the family, but their eyes met over the bales, and the unspoken thought passed between them. Whatever had gone into the ground might have found its way back out, into the very cotton the Chamberlains sold by the ton. The rest of the crop was dried and packed again, shipped downriver once the floods receded. The stained bales, those two obviously marked, were burned behind the warehouse under the overseer's watchful eye. The flames licked high in the damp air, sending up a smoke that smelled faintly, unmistakably, of something more than cotton. Those who breathed it said it stayed with them for days, heavy in the lungs, like a warning that the soil's secrets were never meant to be carried away. The oldest story says it began long before the war, in the summer of 1849, when the air was so dry that the cotton leaves curled in on themselves and the soil cracked underfoot. Elias Chamberlain, already a man of means, walked with the weight of failing crops on his shoulders. 2 seasons of poor yield had cost him dearly, and another would strip away the standing his family had fought to build. It was then, the story claims, that a stranger arrived. No one knew his true name. Some called him a conjure doctor, others a root worker, a man who carried with him jars of powders and bundles of herbs bound in twine. He spoke little in public, but the night after his arrival, lantern light was seen in the grove. A witness, just a boy then, said he saw Elias meet the stranger there, the two standing so close their shadows merged into one. Words were exchanged in a voice too low to carry, but the boy swore he saw the stranger pour a line of ash in a circle and set into it 3 pieces of iron, each rusted and shaped like a key. Fragments from an old diary, later attributed to Elias, make brief mention of that night. Terms agreed. Soil will bear what is asked, if we bear what is asked of us. The writing breaks off, as if the rest were too dangerous to set down. Court transcripts from a distant cousin's estate dispute decades later contain stranger details still. One witness testified that Elias had spoken of securing the family's fortune in the roots, and that nothing grows without being fed. The cousin laughed it off in court, calling it a metaphor, but in the countryside no one laughed. In the years following 1849, the Chamberlain yields flourished. Even in seasons when blight hit neighboring plantations, their cotton stood tall and thick, its bolls full, its fibers bright. And yet, at the close of each harvest, Elias was seen walking into the grove after nightfall, lantern swinging, something heavy wrapped in cloth across his shoulder. By the time of the war, the legend had hardened into certainty for those who lived in the shadow of the estate. The Chamberlains had struck a bargain: iron to bind it, ash to mark it, and blood fresh each year to seal it. What was buried fed the soil, and the soil repaid them in kind. Some versions say the offering was always human. Others say it began with animals, then escalated when greed demanded more. Whatever the truth, the terms were kept. year after year. The iron keys from that first night were said to be buried somewhere in the grove, beneath the largest tree. No one who went looking for them ever claimed to have found them, but those who came too close to digging there swore they heard something moving under the earth, as if the grove itself was warning them away. The Union soldiers came in the waning months of 1863, their blue coats dark with road dust, their boots heavy from days of marching. The Chamberlain plantation lay squarely in their path, its fields stripped bare by the harvest, the great house standing white and proud against the grey sky. Elias Chamberlain greeted them at the porch with the courtesy of a man who knew how to survive a change in power, offering water, bread, and a place to rest. Yet when the officer in command asked to search the property, his manner stiffened. The soldiers were given access to the barns, the stables, and the cotton gin. But when they approached the grove, Elias himself stepped in their path. He said it was private land, dangerous after the recent rains, and of no interest to military matters. The officer pressed, but the family held firm, their voices calm yet unyielding. In the end, the soldiers moved on to the outbuildings scattered along the far end of the fields. Several of these buildings were locked from the outside. The windows were boarded, the doors sealed with chains. The officer noted them in his report, but with no orders to force entry, he let them be. One corporal would later tell a comrade he heard faint movement from within, shuffling, then a sharp, deliberate knock against the door. He said nothing at the time. The cotton gin, though long unused, still smelled of oil and rust. Dust lay thick across the floorboards, but one soldier, a young private named Harlan, wrote in his diary of hearing something else there. While the others examined the machinery, he lingered near the far wall, where the boards felt looser beneath his feet. From below came a sound, not the hollow echo of rats or the creak of settling wood, but a deep, rhythmic pounding, as if someone was striking the underside of the floor with the flat of a hand. Harlan admitted he froze. Listening, the pounding came again, followed by a pause, then 3 sharp blows in quick succession. He glanced toward the others, but no one else seemed to hear. Slowly he stepped back, heart hammering, and left the gin without a word. Some things, he wrote that night, a man is better off not opening. Within days, the soldiers moved on, leaving the plantation untouched. The grove remained undisturbed, the locked buildings unopened, and whatever lay beneath the gin stayed there waiting in the dark, its pounding unanswered. By the winter after the soldiers left, Sarah Chamberlain's letters bore little resemblance to the careful, measured correspondence she once wrote. The loops of her handwriting had grown tight and frantic, the ink pressing so hard into the paper that it sometimes tore through. She no longer wrote to friends or distant cousins. Most were addressed to no one at all, as if the act of writing was meant less for a reader than for herself or for something else entirely. In one letter, she described walking past the gilt-framed mirror in the upstairs hallway and catching a reflection that did not belong to her. It was a man's face, pale and drawn, with eyes that seemed to plead. She wrote that she recognized him instantly, even though months had passed since he disappeared. Nathaniel. When she turned, there was nothing there, but the scent of wet clay clung to the air, strong enough to make her stomach twist. Another page spoke of the grove. She had begun going there in the afternoons, standing just inside the fence. At first, she claimed she went only to watch, to listen, but soon she wrote of feeling her brother's presence within the trees, of hearing his voice in the rustle of leaves, calling her name in a way both loving and urgent. Once, she thought she saw him standing between the trunks, his coat dark with soil, his hand lifted as if to beckon her closer. The dreams came next. Sarah described roots as thick as arms, pale and slick, curling around skeletal hands that reached upward from the ground. She dreamed of lying beneath the soil herself, her breath slow and deep, the earth pressing close on all sides. In the dream she was not afraid, only aware that something vast and patient was holding her there. Her language became more fragmented as the weeks passed. She began repeating phrases over and over. It feeds us. It keeps us. The roots know the way. We belong to it now. Some nights she claimed to wake with dirt under her fingernails, and the faint outline of leaves pressed into the skin of her palms. In her final note, dated only weeks before her name vanished from the records entirely, she wrote in a single unbroken sentence, "The soil has taken us all in some way, I just wait my turn." There was no signature, no salutation. The ink trailed off at the end, as though the pen had simply fallen from her hand. That last letter was found decades later, tucked into the seam of a writing desk drawer, its edges curled and brittle. The faint smell of clay still lingered on it, though the wood of the desk had long since dried to dust. No one knows whether she wrote those words from fear or from acceptance. The first winter after the war settled over the Chamberlain land like a long breath held in the chest. The great fields lay bare, the last bolls picked months before, yet the furrows remained neat, their lines unbroken by wind or time. Neighbors noticed that the gates stayed shut, and the road to the house showed no sign of wagon wheels. No one seemed to come or go. The windows were dark most evenings, and no smoke rose from the kitchen chimneys. Still, the place did not look abandoned. The fences stood straight, the tools were stored, and the fields somehow were kept in order. Whispers grew in town that the Chamberlains had sent away what remained of their workers, unable or unwilling to pay for help. But if that was true, who was tending the land? By day the fields were empty, the grove still, the air holding only the distant cries of crows. Yet more than one traveler claimed that the nights told a different story. Those who passed close after dark spoke of shapes moving through the rows, figures too far to make out clearly, yet too solid to be tricks of fog. Lanterns glimmered in the distance, their light swaying slowly between the bare stalks. The movement had a strange rhythm, unhurried but constant, like work done by hands that never tired. Some swore they heard the faint rustle of cloth, the soft pull and snap of cotton being picked, though there was nothing left to harvest. One man, riding past on a moonless night, felt his horse tense beneath him. He looked toward the fields, and saw what he thought was a line of people walking, heads bowed, each carrying something cradled in their arms. When he stopped to watch, the line dissolved into the mist. Another swore that when he looked back over his shoulder, the lanterns had gone out all at once, as though someone had cupped a hand over each flame. By morning there were no tracks. Not from boots, not from hooves, not even from wheels. The soil lay smooth and undisturbed, except for the rows themselves, which seemed sharper, cleaner than they had the day before. And always, the ground nearest the grove looked as though it had been pressed down, tamped firm by many feet. The Chamberlains never explained it, and no one dared to press them. The silence around the estate grew heavier with each passing season. In time, people stopped walking that road altogether, choosing the longer path to town. But every so often, someone new would take the shortcut on a winter's night, and if they were unlucky enough to glance toward the fields, they might see a lantern swaying far in the distance, keeping time with footsteps they could not hear. When Elias Chamberlain died, there was no great gathering of mourners, no procession through town. His body was kept in the house for 2 days, the curtains drawn tight, and then buried in the family plot without a sermon. Those who attended said Sarah stood at the head of the grave, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the trees beyond the fence, rather than on the coffin being lowered into the ground. The will was read a week later, in the dim light of the study. There were few surprises at first. The land, the house, the outbuildings, all passed to Sarah. The remaining accounts, what little was left of the family's money, were to be managed in her name. But then came the clause that made the room fall still. Sarah was forbidden, under any circumstance, from selling the land or any part of it. More than that, she was to maintain and protect the grove and all its holdings. The words were deliberate, set apart from the rest, as though their weight required its own space on the page. Holdings. It was an odd word for a patch of trees. Land could be owned, yes, but what could the grove hold that needed such protection? Neighbors who heard of the will's terms said it confirmed what they had long suspected, that whatever tied the Chamberlains to that place was more than sentiment. Some whispered that Elias had hidden something there, something valuable enough to guard even after death. Others suggested the opposite, that the grove held something dangerous, something that must never be disturbed if the family wished to survive. Sarah made no move to challenge the terms. She kept the fence in good repair, the iron gate locked, the keys close to her at all times. No one saw her inside the grove after her father's passing, but more than one neighbor claimed to hear the sound of digging on nights when the moon was thin. A few swore they saw her lantern light drifting among the trunks, pausing for long moments before vanishing entirely. Years passed, and still the grove stood untouched, its ground unbroken to any eyes but hers. Those who worked for her said she kept a map of the property folded inside her writing desk, the grove marked with small inked symbols they could not decipher. If she spoke of it at all, it was only to warn the curious away. The will was filed, the clause unquestioned, and life on the estate went on in its quiet, watchful way. But in town the talk never faded. Whatever holdings the grove kept, they belonged to Sarah now, and by her father's command, she would guard them for the rest of her life. In the early years of the 20th century, a professor from the State University visited the Chamberlain property under the guise of studying old-growth trees. He had heard from a colleague in town that the grove behind the plantation house produced some of the tallest and strongest hardwoods in the county, and he intended to see for himself. At first glance, the trees were impressive, but not extraordinary. Thick trunks, heavy crowns, branches that interlocked to create an almost unbroken canopy. It was when he measured them that the truth began to take shape. By his calculations, these trees were growing faster than any of their kind should. Rings taken from a single fallen limb suggested decades of rapid, almost unnatural development. Their roots pushed deep and wide, weaving together beneath the soil in ways that defied the straight downward growth seen elsewhere. Some of the larger roots curled in strange arcs, looping around pockets of empty space underground before driving deeper. In his notes, the professor described them as roots avoiding yet enclosing voids of unknown origin. Curiosity drove him to collect soil samples. Back in his laboratory, the results unsettled him. The samples contained iron levels far beyond what would occur naturally in the region, along with unusually high phosphates. In agricultural terms, it was the kind of soil that could produce extraordinary yields, if one ignored how it came to be that way. His report made no such speculation, but the numbers spoke for themselves. Decades of organic matter had enriched the grove, the sort of slow feeding that left its mark in every grain of dirt. When the professor returned for a second visit, he brought an assistant and a crude auger to bore deeper into the ground. The first few cores came up rich and dark, smelling faintly metallic. But one, drawn from near the center of the grove, brought with it a smell so sharp and foul that both men turned away. Mixed with the soil were pale fragments that crumbled at the touch, brittle as old parchment. The professor pocketed a few and later sent them to a colleague in another department. The reply was brief, a single sentence: "These appear to be human bone." No official follow-up was ever conducted. The Chamberlain family, still in possession of the land, denied further access, and the professor's notes were quietly filed away in the archives. But the details survived in letters and private correspondence, how the roots seemed to wrap the voids like fingers curling around something held close, how the trees grew stronger with each passing year, how the ground beneath them was richer than any farmer could hope for. In town, people already knew what the scientists only hinted at. The grove thrived because it had been fed, again and again, over generations. And as the professor himself once confided to a friend, those roots do not just seek water, they seek what the earth remembers. In the summer of 1924, Dr. Lawrence Hensley arrived in the county with a satchel full of notes and a curiosity that had already unsettled the locals. He was an amateur historian with a reputation for digging into matters most preferred to leave untouched. For weeks he wandered the outskirts of the old Chamberlain estate, sketching the fields, measuring the distance from the great house to the grove, and speaking to anyone willing to share stories of the family. Hensley's interest, he told friends in town, was the grove itself. He had heard of the unmarked graves, of the strange terms in Elias Chamberlain's will, and of the whispers that the soil there was unlike any other. More than once, he was warned away. The family's last surviving descendant, Margaret Chamberlain, made it clear he was not welcome near the fence, but Hensley was not the sort to turn back. One evening in late August, over drinks at the boarding house, he confided to two acquaintances that he planned to test the soil for what it truly holds. He intended to begin just beyond the fence, far enough to avoid trespass charges, but close enough, he said, to catch the truth in the first shovelful. The next morning, he was seen walking the road toward the estate, an auger over one shoulder and his satchel in hand. He never returned. The search was brief. No tracks were found, no tools, no sign of struggle. The sheriff chalked it up to a man wandering off and getting lost, though the grove was less than a mile from the road. The case faded from public attention within weeks. Decades later, during the renovation of a farmhouse once owned by Hensley's boarding house keeper, a carpenter pried open a sealed panel in the attic and found a small leather-bound journal. Inside were Hensley's notes from that summer, interviews with townsfolk, crude maps of the estate, sketches of the grove's largest trees. The final pages grew erratic, his handwriting uneven, sentences trailing off. The last entry was dated the day he vanished. The page began with a description of the air near the grove. Still, as if the wind knows not to pass here, he noted a low hum beneath the quiet, almost a vibration in the bones. Then, mid-line, the writing stopped. The final words, pressed deep into the paper, read, "I hear them now just beyond the trees." What he heard, and whether it drew him into the grove or drove him from it, remains unknown. But the journal smelled faintly of damp earth when it was found, as if it had been left too long in the ground before someone decided to hide it away. The portrait had hung in the front parlor of the Chamberlain house for more than a century, its colors dulled by dust and time. Painted in 1875, it showed the family at their most formal, Sarah seated at the center in a high-backed chair, her black dress buttoned to the throat, a silver locket resting against the hollow of her neck. Behind her stood two older relatives, faces stern, hands resting on the heads of the great hounds that flanked them. The background was simple, the pale wall of the parlor, and through an open window, a suggestion of the cotton fields beyond. For decades, the painting was little more than a curiosity, passed from one caretaker to another as the house changed hands. It was not until a preservation effort in the late 1970s that anyone looked at it closely. The canvas was badly cracked, the varnish yellowed, and an art historian from the State Museum offered to examine it. As part of the process, he took infrared photographs to see beneath the surface layers. What appeared in those images unsettled everyone who saw them. Behind the family, where the plain wall had always seemed to be, faint outlines emerged. Figures too tall and too thin, their limbs oddly bent, standing in a staggered row. Their faces were indistinct, but the empty sockets of eyes seemed to stare past the family toward the viewer. At the base of the portrait, where the shadows of the dogs fell, were smudges in the shape of hands. Not painted in the way a human hand would be, but ghostly, blurred, the fingers stretched as if reaching upward from the floor. Some speculated it was nothing more than a pigment reaction, the underdrawing bleeding through as the top layers aged. Others believed it was deliberate, a hidden layer painted before the final image, meant to be invisible to the casual eye, but they're all the same, like a secret confession embedded in the canvas. The historian who took the photographs kept copies for the museum's files, but the originals were never made public. Over the years, rumors spread. People claimed the skeletal figures matched descriptions of the watchers Sarah had written about in her letters, and that the reaching hands mirrored carvings found on the grove's inner fence. The more the portrait was discussed, the more it became an object of fascination and dread. The painting still exists, stored in a climate-controlled vault, its frame wrapped and sealed. The last person to see it in person before it was locked away said the cracks in the paint seemed to have deepened since the photographs were taken, as though the image beneath was slowly pushing through. And when he stood before it alone, he felt the distinct sensation of being counted by eyes that did not belong to the living. They came in the spring, 2 men and a woman who had been granted limited access to the old Chamberlain house by its current caretaker. The building was long past its prime. Its shutters sagged, its paint curled in the sun, and the air inside held the dry, brittle smell of wood left too long to itself. They were drawn not to the parlor or the bedrooms, but to the lesser-used halls and storage rooms where dust lay thick on the floor. It was there, in a narrow passage off the main dining room, that one of them noticed it. Every step sounded hollow. The woman crouched and ran her fingers along the seams in the boards. The nails were older here, hand-forged and uneven, and in one place the wood had warped slightly, revealing a sliver of brick beneath. They fetched tools from their truck and pried up the boards. What they uncovered was a shaft of cool, stale air rising from the darkness below. A lantern lowered into the gap revealed a brick chamber perhaps 6 feet deep, its walls slick with damp and mottled with a black-green growth. There were no stairs, only a crude iron ladder set into one corner. At the bottom, the lantern light fell on rusted shackles bolted into the walls, pairs for wrists, and longer chains trailing toward the floor. The bricks beneath were stained, the marks radiating outward as though from where something had lain for a long time. No bones remained, but the smell clung to the air, faint but sharp, a ghost of rot. They found 2 more chambers before the afternoon was out, each sealed beneath a different section of flooring. In one, the chains hung from the ceiling instead of the walls. In another, the floor itself was nothing but packed earth, marked by shallow depressions now half filled with dust. The explorers spoke little, as they worked, each aware that they were standing in spaces never meant to be seen again. It was easy, in those rooms, to imagine a connection between what had happened inside the house and the unmarked graves outside. Perhaps the dead had not been taken to the grove immediately. Perhaps some had been kept here first, out of sight, but within reach, until the right night came to bury them. The stains in the brick told a story too ugly to speak aloud. By the time they replaced the boards, the air in the hall seemed heavier, as if the rooms below were breathing up through the cracks. Later, one of the men admitted that when he stood above the first chamber, he thought he heard the faint clink of metal from somewhere below, like a chain shifting against a wall. He had not looked down again. By the time the middle of the 20th century arrived, the Chamberlain name had grown quiet. The sprawling family that had once filled the great house with voices and movement had thinned to a single living descendant, Margaret Chamberlain. She was a slight woman, pale and wiry, with a manner that made people lower their own voices without realizing why. Margaret rarely came into town, and when she did, she moved quickly, eyes fixed on the task at hand. Neighbors said she never lingered for conversation, never stayed long enough for small talk. When local historians or curious reporters sought her out, she turned them away at the gate. A few, through persistence or connections, managed to sit with her on the porch for short interviews. She would speak of the weather, of the state of the fields, of the upkeep required on a house so old. But when questions turned to the family's past, her lips pressed thin, and her gaze drifted toward the grove. More than one interviewer noted the way she seemed to measure its distance, as if keeping track of how far it stood from where she sat. Once pressed by a young man from a historical society about why she never opened the land for public tours, she gave an answer that chilled him. "I don't sleep in any room with a view of those trees," she said, her voice almost flat. "The wind there isn't wind, it's them." She did not elaborate on who them might be. Margaret lived in only 2 rooms of the great house, the kitchen and a small bedroom on the east side, farthest from the grove. Curtains in the western windows were kept drawn at all times. She moved through the house by lamplight, even in the day, claiming the shade kept the air cooler. The few visitors allowed inside described a space stripped of comfort. No family portraits on the walls, no heirlooms displayed, as if she had packed away every trace of those who came before her. Still, the grove remained untouched. The fence was repaired every spring, the iron gate kept locked. She never went near it during the day, but neighbors swore they saw a lone lantern moving along its perimeter some nights, pausing at intervals before vanishing into darkness. In her later years, when her health began to fail, Margaret was offered the chance to sell the property and move into town. She refused outright. "It's mine to keep," she told the doctor who suggested it. "And if I leave, they shall come looking." Whether they were memories, ghosts, or something far older, no one could say. But those who heard her speak the words carried them away like a shadow that followed long after, the image of the grove rising in their minds, its branches shifting in a wind that might not have been wind at all. The auction was held on an overcast morning in the spring of 1972. The Chamberlain estate had stood empty for months after Margaret's death, the windows shuttered, the yard slowly surrendering to weeds. By the time the auctioneer's truck pulled up the long drive, a small crowd had already gathered, locals curious to see the inside for the first time, and bidders from farther afield, hoping to claim a piece of southern history. The house itself was tired but imposing, its white columns streaked with rain and age. Inside, dust lay in soft drifts across the floors, the air heavy with the scent of old plaster and wood that had endured too many humid summers. The auctioneer moved briskly through the rooms, his voice echoing against bare walls as he described fireplaces, fixtures, and acreage. It was when the group reached the back of the property that the mood shifted. The grove stood at the far edge of the fields, fenced with iron bars thicker than a man's wrist. The gates were chained and locked with a rusted padlock the size of a fist. The trees inside swayed slightly, though the air was still, their trunks rising close together, their roots coiling like sleeping animals. One bidder asked if the grove would be cleared before the sale. The auctioneer's answer came with a thin smile and no hesitation. "Best to leave it be. It's part of the property's historical value." When pressed, he added only, "Tampering with it wouldn't be wise." His tone made it sound less like advice and more like a warning. Despite the caution, the land sold that afternoon to a private buyer from out of state, a man in his 40s who spoke little and paid in full. He took possession within a week, moving into the house with the intention of restoring it. For a while, workmen came and went, fixing the roof, repainting the porch, clearing debris from the barns. But within 2 months, the crews stopped coming. Neighbors noticed lights burning in the upstairs windows at all hours, and more than once, a figure pacing the porch long after midnight. The new owner was seen in town less and less, and when he did appear, his face was drawn, his eyes rimmed red as if from sleeplessness. In late summer, without public explanation, the property went back on the market. The man left the county before the sale, telling only one storekeeper why. "You can't sleep there," he said quietly, as if embarrassed. "The noise never stops. Even when it's silent, it's still there. It doesn't let you rest." The estate returned to the auctioneer's hands, the iron gate to the grove still locked, the chains untouched. Whatever disturbances had driven the buyer away, they remained behind, waiting for whoever would come next. The summer of 1994 brought a rare intrusion to the Chamberlain land. After decades of rumor and closed gates, a team of archaeologists from the State University was granted limited permission to excavate along the edge of the grove. The goal, at least officially, was to study burial practices of the mid-19th century. Off the record, several of the researchers admitted they wanted to see if the stories of unmarked graves were true. The first week passed in the slow rhythm of careful work. Stakes marked out neat squares in the soil, each layer sifted and bagged, At a depth of less than 2 feet, one student's trowel scraped against something that was not stone. Brushing away the dirt revealed the curve of a human jaw, the teeth still intact. The skeleton lay face up, wrists bound in heavy iron chains that had rusted into the bone. Then came another and another. Most were arranged the same way, arms pulled tight to the front, chains biting deep, ankles bound together. The soil around them was stained darker, almost black, and in the hollow of each skull's mouth was a compact wad of cotton, dry and brittle, but still holding its shape after more than a century. Forensic specialists were called in. Preliminary analysis suggested the remains dated between 1850 and 1864. Many showed clear signs of violent death, fractures in the ribs, deep notches in the skulls, wrists worn raw from restraint. The cotton in their mouths puzzled the team, though one historian pointed out its use as a way to silence the dying, or to mark them as part of the very crop their lives had been spent harvesting. By the 3rd week, the work slowed to a crawl. 2 separate pieces of digging equipment failed without clear cause, an auger snapping clean in 2, a generator refusing to start despite having fuel. The nights grew restless for the crew camping on site. Several complained of hearing faint metallic clinks near the grove, like chains dragging through soil. One woman swore she heard a man's voice whisper her name from just beyond the tree line. On the morning of the 22nd day, 2 workers packed their things and left without notice. When the lead archaeologist reached them by phone, they gave no explanation beyond refusing to return. That afternoon, the dig was officially halted. The finds were boxed and sent to the university for study, though some of the artifacts, chains, fragments of cloth, never arrived in the catalogue. The excavation pits were refilled, the stakes pulled, the soil tamped flat. The grove remained as it had been, the locked gate holding its silent line. Whatever had been disturbed, it seemed, was better left buried again. It came in late spring of 2003, on an afternoon when the air was heavy enough to press against the skin. The sky over the Chamberlain land had gone the strange, bruised color that warns of storms, though no thunder yet rolled in the distance. Then the first drops began to fall, slow, fat, and dark. Within minutes, the rain quickened, and those who watched from their porches saw the water running down in a red so deep it looked like thin paint. The storm moved strangely, hugging the grove and the fields closest to it. A farmer on the adjoining property swore he could stand with 1 foot in the rainfall and the other in dry dust. By the time it reached full strength, the water pooled in the ruts and low ground around the grove, spreading in wide crimson patches. People who came to look said the smell was worse than the sight, sharp and metallic, the scent of rust and something older beneath it, like meat left too long in the heat. Meteorologists offered an explanation within days. Winds, they said, had carried iron-rich dust from storms in the far southwest. The dust had mixed with the rain, giving it the reddish cast. But those who lived near the Chamberlain place were not convinced. They had seen where the color ran deepest, and it was not in the open fields. It was along the grove's inner fence, where rivulets of water trickled out from beneath the roots, as though the ground itself was bleeding. One man, a retired schoolteacher, walked the edge of the grove the next morning. He said the soil between the trees was soft and black, the puddles still tinged pink. In a few spots, the color seemed to seep upward from below, darkening the water even as the rain eased. He dipped a rag in one of these pools and later swore that the stain would not wash out, no matter how many times he boiled it. By afternoon, the storm had passed, and the red had faded from the standing water, but the smell lingered. For days afterward, anyone passing within sight of the grove claimed the air carried a faint tang, the ghost of that metallic scent. The official reports never mentioned the way the rain seemed to start and stop with the grove, nor how the deepest red pooled where the unmarked graves were said to lie. And though the dust theory made the news, locals told a different story, that something in the soil had been disturbed, and for a brief, heavy hour, the land had let it rise to the surface. When Margaret Chamberlain died in the winter of 2009, the great house had already been standing empty for years. Her passing was quiet, with no surviving family to claim her things, and the estate fell into the hands of a distant legal trust, tasked with cataloguing its contents. The work was slow, hindered by the cold and the house's decay. Drawers stuck in their runners, papers crumbled at the touch, and the air smelled of dust and wood gone brittle with age. It was during the final sweep of the upstairs rooms that one of the appraisers found it, a single envelope resting in the back of a locked desk drawer, the key still in place. The paper was thick, yellowed, and addressed in Margaret's slanting hand, to whoever stays. There was no date, no seal beyond the fold. Inside lay a hand-drawn map of the property. The grove was sketched in detail, each tree marked and numbered. Over the ground beneath, dozens of small red crosses had been inked, uneven in size, but placed with deliberate care. The key on the back of the map labeled them simply, graves. Around the outer fence, Margaret had drawn a second line in black, broken in several places, as if to indicate weak points. Near the largest of these breaks, she had written 2 words, "Not secure." Folded with the map was a note, no more than a few lines. The handwriting wavered in places, as though written by an unsteady hand, but the meaning was clear. "Disturb 1," it read, "and the rest will come." The appraisers showed the papers to the trust's representative, who advised that they be filed with the other documents for historical review. But word spread quickly among the few locals still living near the property. Some took it as proof of the old stories, that the grove's dead were bound together in some way, each tied to the other like links in a chain. Others said it was nothing more than the ramblings of an old woman, grown eccentric in her solitude. In the months that followed, the estate remained unsold. The house was too far gone for easy restoration, and the land came with too many restrictions for development. The grove, with its locked gate and rusted fence, stayed untouched. But the map existed now outside of Margaret's keeping, and copies of it began to circulate quietly, passed from hand to hand in the back rooms of bars and over late-night tables. Some saw it as an invitation, others a warning. Either way, it marked the first time in generations that the exact locations of the graves had been known to anyone beyond the Chamberlain family. And once such knowledge is loose in the world, it has a way of finding the kind of people who will not be able to leave it alone. In the end, all the pieces fit together, though the picture they form is not one anyone would want to hang in their home. From Elias Chamberlain's whispered meeting in the summer of 1849, to the 73 graves dug in the frozen earth of 1863, to the ledger's quiet admissions and Sarah's unraveling letters, the story is one of debt. Not the kind measured in coin, but in something far more lasting. The soil beneath the grove was not just fed by the dead, it was bound to them, its strength drawn from what was given and taken in equal measure. The cotton empire rose on that bargain. Year after year the harvests stayed strong, even when drought and blight claimed the land around them. And each year something or someone was carried into the grove, laid down in the earth as payment. The roots drank deep, curling around bone, holding the memory of every offering. Those who came too close heard voices in the branches, saw shapes moving between the trunks, felt the press of eyes that had not been human for a very long time. Modern eyes have tried to explain it away. Iron-rich soil, strange wind patterns, pigment reactions in an old painting. But taken together, the details resist dismissal. The chained remains with cotton in their mouths, the red rain that smelled of rust, the map Margaret Chamberlain left behind, each grave marked with careful, deliberate strokes. It all points to a covenant that was never broken. Now the Chamberlain bloodline is gone. There is no one left to walk the fence at night, to tend the gate, to keep the soil's hunger in check. The grove stands alone at the edge of the field, its iron bars streaked with rust, its shadows gathering beneath the thick canopy. If the price was blood, the question is no longer whether it will be paid, but who will pay it next. Debts like that do not disappear. They wait, they shift, they find the living, and the map, passed quietly from hand to hand since Margaret's death, has a way of drawing people who mistake warnings for challenges. The last image lingers, the grove at dusk, the light fading to the color of ash, the air heavy and still. The trees sway almost imperceptibly, though not a single blade of grass beyond the fence moves. It is not the wind. It is never the wind. Something in the soil stirs, patient and certain, knowing that sooner or later someone will step inside. And when they do, the roots will be ready.